The Super Nintendo library is absolutely packed with weird, wonderful and criminally overlooked whippers that deserve a second chance. From offbeat RPGs to action games that never made it out of Japan, there is a treasure trove waiting for you if you know where to look. Matey. Let's start today with a licensed tie-in for an anime that probably would have aired at like 11 PM and you'd only catch it after waking up from some kind of frube-infused nightmare. Mangoku Shonen Papuwa-Kun, sorry, all of Japan, a strange little gem, though naturally it stayed stuck in Japan like a lot of the good stuff did. The Super Nintendo or Super Famicom may just have had the best Japan exclusive library of any console ever. It's based on the Papuwa-Kun anime and manga from the 90s, which is pretty hard to find anywhere these days. Basically, imagine watching Gilligan's Island after drinking a bottle of Lucozade from 1996, and you have the right idea. Tropical island, dogs, sentient fish, gangsters, energy beams, slight derangement, you know, the works. The game itself, it's a 2D action platform that actually looks quite lovely. You play as Papuwa himself, wandering around his bizarre little island, dodging enemies, chucking shells, and generally existing in a world that feels like it was designed during a sugar crash. Controls are simple but snappy, and leans more into light action and exploration rather than hardcore platforming precision. Visually, it absolutely holds up. The backgrounds are bright and vivid, the characters bounce with personality, and the music does get a bit funky and weird and funky too. It's not trying to be a sprawling epic, it's breezy and a bit charmingly dumb. It's pretty dumb, but you're absolutely not going to get as much out of this if you aren't already a fan of the IP. Combat's also basic, and difficulty-wise it barely gets above like a mild jog. It's barely above an hour long if you know what you're doing as well, and you'll obviously need to hunt down the partially complete fan translation to know what everyone is yapping about, and still you might be a bit confused. Still, as forgotten anime tie-ins go, it could have been much worse. It's a fun little time. Plus, you get to beat people up with seashells. What more could you want? You remember biker mice from Mars, right? Of course you do, you're cool. That glorious 90s fever dream where mutant rodents from space ride motorbikes and fight crime was the pinnacle of keep chucking nouns together licensing that bankrupted your parents back in the day. Good times. Released in 1994, the SNES game took the source material and swerved straight into isometric racing territory. It's basically, right, rock and roll racing with a coat of 90s cartoon weirdness, and honestly, it's not half bad. It's actually pretty good. You pick from the gang and a few villainous types, and race across track littered with jumps, hazards, and the odd power-up designed to make your mates hate you. It's got a surprisingly junky sense of speed for the Super Nintendo, and the controls are tight enough once you get used to the slightly odd isometric angle. Visually, it's pretty decent as well. Bold, colourful sprites, plenty of cartoon charm, and enough explosions to remind you that this is very much aimed at kids fueled by cereal with 4 times the amount of daily recommended sugar. The soundtrack's even got a few crunchy guitar riffs. That said, it's obviously not flawless. Single player can get repetitive, the AI's got that classic rubber banding stuff going on, and if you're expecting a traditional action platformer like the, TMNT games, you'll be left wondering where all the punching is. Really quite a shame we're still waiting on the world's first bike 'em up, really. But as a forgotten, mildly chaotic arcade racer with a Saturday morning cartoon coat of paint, yeah, it's aged better than you'd expect. You absolutely don't need to know the lore about space bike and mice to enjoy it either. That's clearly where this one went very, very wrong. The proof is in the review scores. Gunpull Gunman's Proof feels like someone at Lennar played A Link to the Past, fell asleep watching a Clint Eastwood marathon, and then woke up determined to mash the two together, aliens and all. Wait, cowboys and aliens? What a ridiculous concept. Dropped onto the Super Famicom in 1997, Gunman's Proof takes familiar top-down adventuring and gives it a western twist, complete with sci-fi nonsense and even some evil ghosties too. You play as a farm kid in the American frontier who quickly becomes possessed by an alien space cop named Zero. Modern devs, up your storytelling please. The mission, hunt down intergalactic criminals disguised as outlaws on your almost upsettingly compact horse, why is he so compact, all while wearing your best cowboy hat and blasting everything that moves. It's ridiculous, self-aware, and oddly charming. The controls borrow heavily from Zelda, with tight movement, dungeon crawling, and item collection, but swap swords for 6 shooters and bazookas. There's an actual run button too, which is kind of neat. Visually it's bright and cartoony, leaning into comedy more than grit, with enemies ranging from mutant cows to literal space bandits. The writing is deliberately daft, like a Cultured Vulture's intro, full of self-referencing NPCs and oddball humour that feels closer to Earthbound than your standard Western. That said, Gunman's Proof isn't flawless. The difficulty is on the easy side. The dungeon design obviously rarely hits the heights of its inspiration, and it's all over in like under 10 hours. But for a game buried at the very end of the console's life, it does deliver a weird, entertaining slice of action that never takes itself too seriously. It never left Japan officially, but fan translations are out there and it's a lot easier than you might expect. And honestly, it is worth a go, if only to say you've played the only sci-fi Wild West action-adventure that successfully steps onto Zelda's turf. You'd be smart to give it a try. There's Hidden Gem, and then there's Smart Ball, the kind of game that's arguably more interesting for what happened around it than what's actually on screen, though the game itself isn't half bad at all. Released on the SNES in 1992, Smart Ball is a charming, slightly oddball platformer where you control a sticky little blue blob named Giri, bouncing and sliding through minimalist side-scrolling levels. In Japan it was called Jerry Boy, which sounds like the sort of insult American soldiers would have hurled across the beaches in 1944, but here it's just an innocuous mascot platformer with a curious legacy. You see, first off, it was published by Sony. Yes, Sony, before the PlayStation, back when they were still testing the waters in gaming with titles on their future competitors' hardware. Stranger still, it was developed by Game Freak, who only a few years later would create Pokemon and also accidentally the Philosopher's Stone, making some people into children for eternity. Adding another bit of trivia to the pile, the soundtrack was co-composed by Akira Yamaoka. Yep, this is his first ever video game credit before he went on to make Silent Hill unnervingly atmospheric and everyone's childhood sleep much, much worse. The game itself? Well, it's decent enough. The visuals are bare bones, the environments can get repetitive, and it leans more on charm than spectacle. Jerry can stretch, stick to walls, and roll around, which feels novel for a while, but the difficulty does sneak up on you. Beneath the cutesy mascot sheen, Smart Ball is tougher than it looks, with some surprisingly tricky platforming sections. It's not going to blow your mind, but Smart Ball is worth a look for the historical oddness alone. An early Game Freak? Yes, Game Freak of Pikmin, a Sony-published Nintendo game, and Yamaoka's humble start, all wrapped up in a slightly wobbly little blob. Very Nosferatu. Super Nintendo isn't exactly remembered for its dark, brooding games. This is the console of bright platformers, cheery RPGs, and pastel-coloured mascots with big eyes and bank accounts. But Nosferatu sticks out like an undead thumb. Well, if you ever came across it, that is. Released in 1995, Nosferatu arrived pretty late in the Super Nintendo's life, when everybody was already daydreaming about polygons and CD-ROMs. It's basically Prince of Persia meets classic horror, with you playing a nameless hero who's punching, kicking, and awkwardly clambering his way through a gloomy gothic castle to save his girlfriend from the clutches of Nosferatu. I've mentioned it already, but it is hard to not compare this one to Prince of Persia. Deliberate, slightly sluggish movement, tricky platforming, and animation cycles that make everything feel a touch more hefty than you'd expect. It's all about timing jumps, dodging traps, and occasionally decking skeletons, bastard skellies. You even get to do your best Swayze impression and roundhouse kick ghouls right in the chops. Visually, Nosferatu does a lot with the Super Nintendo's hardware, leaning hard into moody lighting and detailed backgrounds. I love the bronzes and yellows here, it gives it a real earthy kind of vibe. The soundtrack broods along in the background, channeling low-budget Hammer horror energy, and those pretty awesome cutscenes just add to that. The devs at Seta clearly cared, even if it feels about 5 years out of step with the rest of the SNES library. It's not going to be for everyone though, the controls can feel clunky and the pace is glacial compared to your Marios or Mega Mans. Manses? But there's a charm to how committed Nosferatu is to its spooky, awkward aesthetic. If you liked Prince of Persia or not another world, but just wish there were more bastard skellies you can punch in the face, Nosferatu will definitely give you what you want for an afternoon. Quite frankly, the premise for Evo Search for Eden is extremely ambitious for 1992, the year in which the game was released by publisher Enix. Known for role-playing games like the Dragon Quest series, Evo makes a little more sense given their experience. However, developer Almanac created something very different that used the RPG mechanics as a jumping point to something very, very interesting. Divided into several distinct geological periods, each period consists of several stages. You begin the game as a sea organism that must evolve into something developed and powerful. This is where the RPG portion makes sense, with players using points to evolve their character as they progress in the non-linear story. Evolving your character in this fashion is fun and was pretty unique for a console game in the early 90s, isn't it? It sounds pretty unique and fun now if you ask me. While perhaps a little slow-paced at times, Evo Search for Eden is a fully realised premise with surprisingly addictive gameplay. It's not a huge surprise this game slipped under the radar in 1992 given its decidedly odd premise and, let's be honest, bad name, but it's one we'd love to see more people talk about. The Ignition Factor is a good case in point that Jaleco sometimes made really good games, offering a release that's both a shooter and technically a firefighter sim. Each level pits you and your firefighting gear against massive burns across multiple rooms, in large areas, or even across the entire floor of a building. Yes, I messed up saying areas there, but let's move on. Your task is to put out the fire, yes, but as you'll soon discover after a few minutes, there's a lot more to it than that. The Ignition Factor offers some surprising variety in the fires you'll be fighting, with a number of environmental challenges to keep the straightforward, addictive gameplay feeling fresh. You'll also find yourself exploring your dangerous surroundings a good deal more than you might like, and the game is good at creating an atmosphere of tension as you battle the flames and look for people to rescue. Good graphics, especially for a Jaleco game, are a neat little bonus on top. It's not the deepest game of all time, but there's a lot of unique challenge here, and it's available to play on the Switch's SNES Virtual Console. No, we didn't choose this just because of the name, which does weird. While the gameplay is a tad uninspired, and you should get ready for some of that cheap 90s video game frustration we all know and love, Excalibur 2097 is a visually striking, action-packed hack and slash that's well worth a look for fans of that kind of frenetic, frustrating experience. Set in the dystopian hellscape of 2097, if you can believe it, players control the appropriately named Slash across a series of stages that will have you battling relentless hordes of enemies, not to mention bosses that even someone with experience in these sort of games will find pretty challenging. Hope you're a fan of visually horrifying monsters that block most of your attacks. Yeah, it's not hard to see why Excalibur 2097 didn't quite find its audience in 1994. You have to experience the game in motion to appreciate its unique art style, stiff challenge, and that utterly fantastic soundtrack by Psycho Sonic. While experienced run and gun fans may find less of a challenge than others, anyone who appreciates steady action and great character designs will want to check this out. We just wish the game went on for a little longer, although most people will probably never want to play it ever again after beating that final boss, Blanca looking dead ass motherfucking bitch. It makes sense to find Phantom 2040 among a list of underrated SNES games, since it's based on the also extremely underrated 1990s cartoon inspired by the 1930s newspaper comic strip. While you absolutely do not need to watch Phantom 2040 to appreciate this action-adventure platformer, go check it out anyway. It's pretty sick. Phantom 2040 as a vidigam will be of particular interest to Metroidvania fans. Much of your time here will be spent running around elaborate, challenging areas with different paths connecting you to different story beats that can have dramatic influence upon the ending you receive. That and the heavy emphasis on exploration gives Phantom 2040 an impressive degree of depth, but the gameplay is still easy to pick up and play too. Again, Metroidvania fans do not want to sleep on Phantom 2040, as it's another SNES game with a stellar soundtrack, memorable character designs, and a sense of fast-paced, fluid action that impressively feels right at home with the slower, more exploratory portions of the game. While the box art for Harley's humongous adventure might suggest some pretty standard 90s fare. Look at the dude's shades and backwards cap, I mean. The actual experience of playing this unique platformer is something else altogether. A title that may make some dudes feel threatened is no doubt one of the reasons why this game got so little attention in 1993 and still isn't mentioned nearly as often as we'd like by SNES fans. Delivering on its promise of a humongous adventure starring a guy named Harley, who sadly is not Harley Race, players find themselves shrunk down to the size of a bar of soap. It's your job now to find the pieces of your shrinking machine strewn around your house in order to return Harley to his normal size. It's a cute premise that may have been lifted from the Mouse House a little bit, and Harley's humongous adventure doesn't let you down on exploring that idea to its potential. The stages of the game take you to different parts of the house with everything appropriately made to scale. You're going to be driving a toy tank, battling a giant rat, and just trying to survive amidst the game's bizarre sense of humour and blend of digitised claymation and traditional pixel art. Don't expect the world from it, and you'll have a pretty nice time. Lufia 2 is a clever example of the RPG genre and deserves to be considered in the same breath as the more well-known RPGs that came to the SNES in the 90s. Despite being set 99 years before the first game, Lufia and the Fortress of Doom, you really don't need to play the first game to have fun here. Playing as an ancestor of the first game's protagonist, players will learn the origins of that game's antagonists while exploring complex, often baffling dungeons. Most RPGs emphasise solving puzzles to some degree, but Lufia 2 Rise of the Sinistrals makes much more out of them, meaning you'll be exploring and searching for a variety of items to help you move along. Lufia 2 also has a capsule monsters system to run alongside its traditional turn-based structure. Monsters you find along your journey can become invaluable allies, made even stronger by giving them certain items, such as armour and fruit. Give me a kiwi and I can take on the world. The soundtrack by composer Yasunori Shiono is also a highlight, underscoring an RPG that just wasn't graphically flashy enough to be a hit back in its day, and that's reflected in its price today. Wow. We're back again with Enix for Soul Blazer, which feels at times like a spiritual relative to the Legend of Zelda games. Enix really seemed to have a knack for publishing unique games that seemingly no one wanted to play. We can perhaps blame the failure of Soul Blazer on poor distribution. The truth is that there were just too many games to go around for the SNES at the peak of its lifespan. Most of us just couldn't keep up at the time, but Soul Blazer deserves to blaze its way into your soul.
What the hell are you talking about?
Soul Blazer starts to feel like its own special thing once you start getting into the meat of the game, which sees you travelling to exotic places, slaying demons, saving souls, and rebuilding the world in the aftermath of a cataclysmic event. You'll be travelling back and forth between the 6 worlds of the game quite a bit, destroying the seals found throughout to release the souls trapped inside. Each seal you encounter influences the game in some way, and while this formula doesn't change too much, it never stops being deeply engrossing either. Soul Blazer is a surprisingly dark game for the SNES, as it's not every day you have to rescue cursed souls to refill a completely depleted world, but the somber premise helps Soul Blazer stand apart from the hordes of other RPGs on the console. A rare RPG on the SNES that nobody bought from Enix. Yeah, you probably saw the $300 CIB price tag coming from a mile off here, didn't you? Crikey. While Gemfire may not be as famous as Koei titles like Romance of the Three Kingdoms or Dynasty Warriors, it's interesting to see one of their strategy games in a traditional fantasy format. 6 wizards are freed from a gemstone and are each tasked with restoring order to a kingdom under tyrannical rule. Each wizard has sided with one of the powerful families of the region, and it's up to you to marshal magic and tangible resources to bring peace to the land by any means necessary. Gemfire is definitely a game that came from the developers of Romance of the Three Kingdoms, with players leading their armies into combat with careful attention being necessary to every detail of the campaign. However, compared to the Romance system, which has very similar mechanics to Gemfire, the latter is much more streamlined and accessible. It's easy to get a sense of what you have, including melee mounted range and most interestingly of all, magic units, and build something that will bring the other houses down. There's still a lot to absorb here, particularly for newcomers to the turn-based strategy genre, but Gemfire has addictive gameplay against a fascinating narrative backdrop. The diversity in monsters alone speaks to this game's depth. Also, that box art, cold. Uni Races is pure simple joy, as video games tend to go. You control a unicycle along a 2D course that's filled with obstacles. That's basically it. There's a level of accessibility here that makes it something that almost anyone with even a vague interest in gaming can enjoy. Yeah, it's a relatively beloved game, but it still doesn't get enough dang credit for being one of the best races on the SNES. Uni Races is simple in concept and execution, but it's when you begin to rely on increasingly elaborate tricks to score the points necessary to beat the clock or your opponent that it starts to cook. And Uni Races suddenly becomes a shockingly inventive and challenging racer. You'll be pushing yourself to come up with better and better tricks. Don't know why I said better like that. Not surprisingly, the 2-player mode is spectacular fun. So what happened to Uni Races then? While the game sold its initial run of 300,000 copies, the game was suddenly pulled from production due to a lawsuit from Bad Guys Pixar. The animation studio argued that Uni Races stole its concept from their 1987 short film Red's Dream. The judge's ruling seemingly coming down to the fact that yes, both of these things did have a unicycle in them. It's arguably the biggest reason why this game didn't go further. Uni Races then and now deserves a hell of a lot better than being the victim of a frivolous lawsuit. Uni Races, unite! Even if you didn't play The Legend of the Mystical Ninja for the SNES, there's a good chance you'll recognise the box art as soon as you see it. That kid and that tiger are ready to kick some serious arse, and we should probably just get out of their way and put the pipe down while we're at it. Part of the very long-running Gambari Goemon series, The Legend of the Mystical Ninja is a fantastic hybrid of overhead view action games and fast-paced platforming. Controlling either Goemon, an iconic Japanese folk hero dating back to the 16th century, or his partner Ibisumaru, players split their time between brawling and throwing items in the aforementioned overhead sections and managing some very tricky platform mechanics in the second part. It's a good formula that keeps the proceedings from ever getting too stale. Not only is The Legend of the Mystical Ninja a lot of fun to play, but it's also a lot of fun to just look at. Bright, vivid graphics and some memorable character designs make it easy to play through the entire game, and wish there was even a little more at the end. Maybe someday we'll get that collection we all suddenly find ourselves wishing was really a thing. We also wish this ad for the N64 game was a real thing too. Leisure Suit Goemon when? Before they joined up with Square, publisher Enix released some truly exceptional games from the 8-bit era all the way up to the PS2. Almost everyone knows their most famous franchise, Dragon Quest, but 1994's SNES release Robotrek is one of those Enix games that's fallen into relative obscurity. Doesn't seem fair for a graphically distinct, funny and unique science fiction RPG revolving around a young boy named Rococo searching for his father, does it?
The more comedic tone of the game might be why its Japanese name is Slapstick. Perhaps the North American marketing for the game failed to emphasize what a goofy time players would be in for here. Robotrek, which sees players building and customizing robots to join them in battle, sold poorly in the West, received some pretty average reviews, and disappeared from view shortly after its release. Today, building and customizing a robot you must effectively raise doesn't sound all that strange. Monster hunting and games emphasizing deep control over how your inventions look and perform can be found everywhere from Pokemon to Armored Core, but it seems people just weren't quite ready for Robotrek yet. Featuring charming pixel art and an ATB system for combat, Robotrek was maybe just too strange for players in 1994, but is an absolute delight in 2024. Don't let the whimsical sci-fi graphics of the late-stage SNES action game Big Sky Trooper fool you. While Big Sky Trooper is pretty straightforward at the beginning, the depth of gameplay and elaborate level design reveal a much more complex, difficult title. Pretty apt for a game that uses the same engine as Zombies Ate My Neighbors. The game gives you a ship which you can communicate with, and the missions begin after a pretty, admittedly confusing start. You'll be travelling to different worlds to find parts for your ship, rescue people, or exterminate every member of the invading space slugs you come across. There are also shooter segments similar to arcade classics like Asteroid. Later, you'll be donning a spacesuit and heading down to the surface for a range of different tasks and missions. There's even a handful of pretty enjoyable side quests to check out here. There's really quite a lot going on under the surface of Big Sky Trooper. While the controls are sometimes a little clunky, particularly in the shooter segments, you gotta admire Big Sky Trooper for sticking the landing of its own bizarre premise and sense of presentation. This is graphically one of the most unique cartoon-style games on the console. Anyone looking for something markedly different from the norm on the SNES should get Big Sky Trooper immediately, if only to fill in your back catalogue of weird, forgotten LucasArts games. We'll look at Defenders of Dinotron City one of these days. Maybe, probably not. HAL Laboratory is best known for the Kirby franchise, but SNES titles like Earthbound and the intense rail shooter Hyperzone are reminders that they've done some truly standout work over the decades. They also did Kirby Battle Royale. Yeah, and look, nobody's perfect. Hyperzone is well deserving of a second look from them, with gameplay that reminds you of Space Harrier and Mode 7 aesthetics that evoke similar visuals of the time like those found in F-Zero. This is a sadly forgotten SNES game that you should be hyped-zoned to play. We'll work on that. Hyperzone pushes you across a pretty challenging balancing act of maintaining the perfect speed while blasting away at anything that moves. Go too fast and the ship will obviously crash. Go too slow and you'll also begin to incur damage. There's nothing too nuts about this, but there's always something to be said for a game that strikes a good mix of accessibility and ever increasing difficulty. Not to mention that banger soundtrack combined with a game whose length made it a perfect rental to build your weekend around. What's interesting about Hyperzone is that other than Star Fox, there really isn't a lot else on the Super Nintendo that's quite like it. True rail shooters are tough to come by on the SNES, and the relative obscurity of this early title is maybe why. It hasn't been ported to absolutely anything since, and that's a pity. An arcade release that was ported to just about every console and computer under the sun between 1990 and 1992, Rampart is a tower defense game that existed well before that genre even had a name. There's probably even an alternate timeline in which they're called Ramparticles or Rampartvanias or something. Controlling and defending a territory protected by immense walls, the game has a focus on strategy that made it a little unusual during its release at the start of the SNES's lifespan, as well as basically every other platform going. You know you're hitting all bases when Wikipedia hits you with the various. Rampart looked excellent on the SNES though, and still looks good for its age, owing to the use of Mode 7 graphics to create a vibrant 3D environment. Rampart can be a surprisingly addictive game on its own, but it's when you start a multiplayer battle against one or two other players that things get really interesting. Rampart didn't really have a genre to belong to when it was first released the SNES in 1991, the year that Legends were born, and it's hard to say how well the game sold since the sales data doesn't seem to exist anywhere. In all likelihood, it wasn't a huge seller, or it wouldn't be such a relative obscurity in the present day. Still, it was a perfect rainy day game, drawing in unassuming kids everywhere with a surprisingly addictive promise of turning bedrooms everywhere into the battleground for a civil war. Part of the Assault Suit series and a prequel to the Genesis game Target Earth, Cybernator, also known as Assault Suits Vulcan, is set in a bleak world in which countries fight over limited resources, with soldiers piloting giant mechs in locations across the world and even in outer space. As a member of the Federation, the protagonist is immediately drawn into combat with the rival government known as Axis. Bit on the nose there, guys, which probably gives you a good idea of which side is supposed to be the bad guys. The story and setting are both solid, but it's when you crack open this absolutely gorgeous mecha action platformer that you see why it's such a beloved title for the few who remember it in the 2020s. Cybernator, from a graphical and sound point of view, might be one of the most underrated Super Nintendo games of all time. Featuring 2 distinct endings, a variety of side missions, and combat that has the weight of feeling as though you really are slugging out or blasting away inside a massive mecha, Cybernator really is as cool as its 90s ass name would imply. The subject of some censorship between its Japan release and North American localization, Cybernator is a near perfect marriage of breathtaking backgrounds and details with excellent controls and satisfying combat to boot. Here's another random recommendation with big robots. I was playing the Capcom beat 'em up bundle, whatever it's called lately, and oh man, our Armored Warriors, who played the Armored Warriors, it whips. Go give that a go too afterwards, and then play this next game, which is also in the same bundle. Beat-em-ups were a little bit passé by 1994, when the King of Dragons made its way to the SNES. That might be why it's scarcely remembered today by anyone beyond hardcore genre fans or Capcom completionists. The game is as good as any of its contemporaries on the system, including Capcom's own Final Fight series, and it's worth your time if you consider yourself a fan of bright, vivid brawlers with very light platforming and action RPG elements. The King of Dragons allows you to choose one of 5 characters, including fantasy standards like the Fighter, the Wizard, and the Elf. Each character has their own fighting style and plays a little bit differently, so you're going to want to try out each. More impressive is how much of this arcade game Capcom was able to recreate on the SNES. Yeah, of course, the sprites are a little smaller and only 2 players can fight at the same time, but the core simple fun of beating up bad guys in a lush 2D world remains completely intact. The King of Dragons has found its way onto numerous Capcom collections of late, including the recent Capcom Arcade Second Stadium and Capcom Beat 'em Up Bundle, available for all modern consoles. But it still remains kind of sadly forgotten by more famous games. Stop Dragon. It's out and play this banger. Sorry, whoever writes these puns needs to be fired. Here's a fun game. Take a random name, any name, animal and occupation. Write what you came up with down below. Congratulations, you just created a forgotten 90s gaming mascot. Released for both the SNES and Genesis, Aero the Acro-Bat sees circus performer Aero trying to rescue his fellow performers captured alongside their carnival by a deranged industrialist named Edgar Ector and his associate Zero the kamikaze squirrel and the psycho circus gang. That was a lot at once. Despite all the Looney Tunes ass names, it sounds like a pretty standard platformer for the time, filled with plenty of that enduringly beloved 90s attitude, but that's not the whole story. Aero the Acro-Bat looks great and controls pretty good for the most part, while giving you huge levels that are actually worth travelling through. Each level has different objectives, offering some nice variety and makes good use of Aero's job at the circus as a trapeze artist. That circus is one of the biggest aspects of Aero the Acro-Bat that keeps the game from being ordinary. Jumping along platforms, bouncing off trampolines and defeating enemies with a sometimes very difficult to pull off corkscrew attack. Aero may prove to be a little too frustrating for some casual players, but if you know what platformers were like in the mid-90s, you're likely to still have a blast here. You can even have a blast with it on modern platforms thanks to a modern port that saw the bat released from Caves. Watch for rabies though. Okay, what name did you come up with then? I got Jason the Seagull Sous Chef. I'd eat his food. Mascot platformers were a huge part of the Super Nintendo's success, so much so that by 1993, the year Plok was released to very good reviews and mediocre sales, people were starting to get a little bit sick of them. That might be why this thoroughly unique game from brothers Steve and John Pickford just didn't go anywhere. You may even feel like Plok is a spiritual forefather of Rayman, which is another game that has the hero throwing his hands at enemies. We wish Rayman would throw hands at Ubisoft to get himself a proper game, but we digress. The story in which Plok is searching for a flag that was stolen from him is just a very basic setup to get us to the 16-bit nightmares that await us. Because there's something very vaguely disconcerting about some of the creatures and their designs in this highly unusual game. Plok offers a wide variety of power-ups, but the other gameplay twist is a lot more dramatic. Plok must lose body parts at times to progress. Did somebody say never dead? And there's even a late stage in the game that has you riding some very offbeat vehicles. A lot of 90s stuff that claims to be weird is just kinda crass and noisy. Plok really is as bizarre as some claim it to be, and it was perhaps just a little too weird for SNES players in the early 90s, but it really is just always fun to say. Plok. Plok. One of the first games designed by Shinji Mikami, who would go on to direct games like the first Resident Evil and Dino Crisis, Goof Troop is the only licensed game to make the cut here. You probably remember the hit Disney animated series and films, but you may not recall that Goof Troop is one of the many banger licensed Disney titles released by Capcom during the 90s. And if you think you're getting a basic platformer, or even just a good but ultimately still average platformer, think again, because Goof Troop opted to do something else altogether. While platforming elements are still part of your experience here, the game is not as simple as moving left and jumping along until you reach the end. Goof Troop instead emphasises solving complex puzzles while collecting the necessary items to get to the next point. Even combat in Goof Troop is a good deal different from what you might be thinking. Rather than simply jumping onto your enemies, the game has you using such tactics as throwing barrels, knocking them off their feet and off the stage, or even putting them directly in front of an enemy attack. Goof Troop keeps you guessing and thinking right up until the end. There's an ease and comfort to the control scheme, and that's good because this game's difficulty is anything but comfortable. Don't be a goof and just play it. Seriously, you're driving us nuts with a Z. Well, Ocean wasn't the most reliable name in town when it came to open quotation, good close quotation video games, particularly with their seemingly endless glut of NES and SNES licensed titles. They still occasionally produce some very good games. Mr. Nuts with a Z is a 2D platformer and prime example of just that. Unfortunately, the game doesn't seem like it would have much to offer beyond being yet another mascot platformer that wanted to capitalise on that cool Sonic guy. Is that accurate though? You're a badass squirrel who wants to stop a Yeti with magic powers from taking over the world. Either that sounds like a great time or it doesn't. These are our terms. But experienced fans of these games will find that from its responsive and simple controls to its incredibly rich backgrounds and character sprites, Mr. Nuts has more to offer than just being another product of its time. Even if you hate this character, and it's easy enough to dislike Mr. Nuts at a glance because he really does look like a massive grass, you'll find it's hard to deny that this is just a really good mascot platformer. There's really not much else to say about Mr. Nuts beyond that, apart from that it looks and sounds great, you get plenty of time in which to run around and just explore, and some of the bosses look like they want you to give them something for the pain and let them die. Same bud. Same. If you want a platformer that gets a bit weird with it sometimes, you can do a lot worse than Send Your Nuts. It actually even has a remake on the GBA of all places, so you can even let your nuts loose on the bus. And then play this game.
Yeah, coming out the gate strong here, as we bet we're not the only ones who looked perplexed or scared about how to pronounce it upon seeing the name Rudra Ni Hihou, after it was suggested to us by Mr. Big All with the comment, Rudra Ni Hihou, a very good JRPG, very unknown. We simply had to find out more. Roughly translated into Treasure of the Rudras, which is just what I'm calling it from now on so the Duolingo bird doesn't peck my eyes out, Treasure is a Japan-only SNES RPG released in 1996, a year after the release of the PS1. If that's not mind-boggling enough for you, Treasure of the Rudras was the last game that Square developed for the SNES, known in Japan as the Super Famicom. Far from being another copy-and-paste RPG, Treasure of the Rudras is a wholly unique beast, with its Indian religious influences being the most obvious example of that. Pulling from the Wheel of Time concept, Treasure of the Rudras depicts a world that's destroyed every 4,000 years, with the game picking up just 15 days before the supposed end of humanity. Players can select from 3 different scenarios, playing through them as they wish and making choices that affect the other scenarios. Leave a relic somewhere on day 5 and you can pick it up as someone else after that day. What's most interesting though is the game's custom magic system, which allows you to write down different katakanas or English phrases inside an in-game grimoire. Doing so will unlock different portions of a mantra that can be put together to create devastating spells. It's all pretty neat experimental stuff. If you feel like playing the game yourself, there's some English fan translations knocking about, though shockingly this rare SNES RPG isn't the priciest one ever made. It's no secret how expensive those things are generally. Clearly, Robert Crawford hasn't heard of a secret before, because the guy's out here in our comments blowing up the Secret of Evermore. How about Secret of Evermore? That game deserves more love, he says, without a care in the world about the core concepts of secret keeping. Honestly, cat's out the bag now though, so let's talk about one of the more underrated action RPGs on the SNES. Developed by the North American team at Square, you'd be forgiven for thinking that Secret of Evermore bears more than just a passing resemblance to the legendary Secret of Mana. From the real-time battles to the ring-like menu and HUD system, Evermore was designed to follow the success of Secret of Mana, just a more Americanized version of it. According to the game's lead programmer, that was even a mandate coming from Square Japan at the time. Quite why they'd copy their own product so brazenly is weird, but logic goes out of the window when you're on 90s gaming executive levels of cocaine, I guess. While Secret of Evermore is set in the titular world, the game actually opens with the player character, a young boy from Podunk, USA, being teleported to this magical world thanks to the ever-reliable reason of laboratory malfunction shenanigans. Accompanied by his local dog-turned-transforming wolfhound, the boy explores the 4 different kingdoms of Evermore, each with their own take on specific time periods in human history, while discovering more about the purpose of the hidden laboratory and an ill-fated experiment in Podunk some 30 years prior. Now that Square Enix has re-released Secret of Mana on all platforms, maybe it's time for an Evermore re-release, but the idea might be a bit alien to them. Calling a tie-in game to one of the most successful and iconic film franchises out there a hidden gem does feel a bit silly, but it's also true that film tie-ins still deal with the stigma of being, altogether now, a bit shit. And then you have the fact that it's tied to one of the most polarizing movies ever, and spoiler alert, I do not like Alien 3. I'll never get over it. You can cut the movie up however you like, but I'll never be happy with those first 10 minutes. Well, what were they thinking? Lekan Repost 6732? Close enough, right? Would like the world to know that the Alien 3 game at least deserves re-evaluating. The graphics are nice, the sound is amazing, and the gameplay is solid. Plus, the atmosphere is creepy. Released in 1993, a year after the film's theatrical release, the SNES version of Alien 3 is actually one of 4 different versions of Alien 3 that were developed for various platforms. While the Game Boy version is top-down and focuses more on exploration, puzzle solving, and survival, the other 3 versions are side-scrolling action platformers that see Ripley opening pulse rifle fire on hordes of xenomorphs. However, it's the SNES version that's arguably the most advanced and compelling option. Instead of just running through levels, blasting aliens, and rescuing prisoners, each stage tasks Ripley with completing other objectives, like fixing the pipe, repairing parts of the ship, shooing away executives from 20th Century Fox, and more. It looks great and sounds pretty decent, and overall holds up far better than the weird clip art special effects in the movie itself. While later Alien games would shift the needle more, big up to Aliens vs Predator, you're a real one, Alien 3 still deserves to be celebrated as an excellent shooter/platformer on the SNES, or on whatever certain device you choose to run it on. The SNES is definitely home to a lot of run and gun shooters, so it's always nice to hear about one you may never have heard of. Thankfully, long-time viewer Stratavarius6547 gave us a brilliant suggestion. I feel like Run Saber is an underrated gem I loved back in the 90s. A shooter published by those little legends at Atlas a few years before they'd find incredible success with Persona, Run Saber naturally has an overcomplicated and ludicrous plot that's barely covered in game when there's an explosion happening every nanosecond. Basically, the Earth has reached a point of no return with pollution until a scientist emerges with a wonder chemical that can soak up all the pollution. Psych! The chemical actually turns humans into angry mutants, and the scientist now has an army to rule what's left of Earth. That's kinda slick, not gonna lie, can't be mad at that. He saw his chance and he took it. Humanity lays its hopes on 3 cyborgs, but because there's not enough premise yet, one of the cyborgs has gone rogue, with you controlling one of the 2 who remain. Again, the plot is packed tighter than my skinny jeans with each passing year of my 30s, but all you need to know is that you're blasting monsters across 5 different stages on this ruined Earth. The gameplay is heavily reminiscent of the likes of Strider, while the monster and environmental design calls to mind franchises like Alien. Perhaps a alternative title was at one point HR Gunstar Heroes. Who's to say? As for the monster design, there's a variety and imagination on show here that makes Run Saber one of the most visually distinct games on the entire platform, and you can already say it isn't at least worth a look. Good shout, Strat, good shout. Trying to create a mascot platformer for the SNES must have been a nightmare, living in the shadow of Super Mario and all. Even on the Genesis, Mega Drive if you love your chippy chips, contenders still had to duke it out with Sonic. Still, Royal Guardian is burning a candle for one platformer in particular. Here's one, Ardy Lightfoot. Nice little platformer. Thumbs up emoji. Cheers, Dad. Your mileage may vary on the nice descriptor there though, as Ardy Lightfoot earned a bit of a reputation not long after its release as being one of the more challenging platformers on the SNES. Hardy Lightfoot more like it, etc, etc, and so on. The game follows the standard cutesy platformer plot as the titular fox sets out across the world to find 7 pieces of a MacGuffin before the evil King Visconti can gather them all first. Along the way he's aided by a couple of friends, including a blue penguin creature called Peck, who Ardy can fling at his enemies with reckless abandon as his main form of attack. Neat. If you're hit, Peck disappears. Dies. And needs to be reclaimed from a chest, and if you get hit without Peck, you die. Essentially, Peck is being used as a blue man's shield for Ardy, which is hilariously dark and yet somehow not even the darkest thing in the Super Famicom version of Ardy Lightfoot. All I'm going to say is worm stomach acid and bones, and wow, that cat did not deserve that, and leave it at that. Capcom were prolific when it came to porting their coin-op arcade games to the SNES, and while most of them weren't arcade-perfect ports, they still formed wonderful core memories for many SNES owners. That would include with a suggestion, Magic Sword 1992 would be my favourite forgotten SNES game. A fantasy platformer beat-em-up originally released to arcades coming off the back of Black Tiger, which many consider to be a spiritual precursor of Swords. Magic Sword Heroic Fantasy saw players control a brave hero, inexplicably called Alan. Not mocking anyone's name here, of course, but Alan sounds like he's going to fix your boiler rather than save the world, or get lost in a lake, or is it an ocean? Anyway, a great evil known as Lord Drockmore has obtained the Black Orb and has shacked up at Dragon's Tower, a 50-floor labyrinth filled with monsters, minions, and malcontents. And the evildoer has grand designs on plunging the world into total darkness. Time to go climb that tower and knock Drockmore down a peg or 20. As Alan, you'll traverse the 50 floors of hell, encountering bad guys and a host of allies that can even level up and unlock new skills. While Magic Sword's legacy and reputation is somewhat diminished compared to Final Fight or Capcom's officially licensed Dungeons & Dragons beat-em-ups, Magic Sword is no less deserving of your attention. Just make sure you also pay attention to the dialogue options in the final boss. The streets won't forget. The streets will never forget. You might not think it, but sometimes us humble curators of retro content are asked to perform acts to the benefit of the public's health and safety. You might be confused to learn this, and we were too, so let Space Sergeant 101 explain themselves. What? No troddlers? I've been diddled again! In the interest of stopping some kind of public incident, let's talk about Troddlers, a Lemmings-inspired puzzle game that was originally released for the Amiga before being remade for the SNES. Troddlers sees players trying to corral the titular Troddlers to the teleport exit, dodging traps, hazards, and zombie Troddlers along the way. The word Troddlers already sounds like pure nonsense, doesn't it? Like Histombala or non-fungible. While the Lemmings influence is immediately obvious, Troddlers differs from Lemmings in a few key ways. Firstly, you actually control your own character instead of playing as an omnipotent source guiding the creatures. Secondly, how you guide the creatures is massively different, as instead of bestowing jobs like in Lemmings, you plant and erase blocks to form a path for the Troddlers. Certain blocks have special effects, thereby creating the challenge. Oh, and there's also zombie Troddlers that can kill you and friendly Troddlers. There's a lot of troddling going on here, and a bit too much for my silly little mouth, but thanks to Troddlers' Amiga background, it's also one of several games to support the SNES mouse. That's pretty metal. Look, we get it, we hear you loud and clear. After including Cybernator in our sadly forgotten SNES games video, we were inundated with literally a handful of comments about how Metal Warriors is better, or at least deserves a mention. Well, who are we to argue with that? This is Democracy Manifest, people! Created mostly by the LucasArts team responsible for Zombies Ate My Neighbors, an absolute whipper for all time, Metal Warriors follows Stone, a lieutenant of the titular rebel group fighting against the evil Dark Axis Empire. A side-scrolling run-and-gun shooter,
which was the style at the time.
Metal Warriors and Cybernator share a lot of similarities, as you control a giant mech suit going ham in the enemy's bases, blowing up everything that moves. Where Metal Warriors differs greatly from Cybernator is in both the choice of mechs, as you get to choose from 6 mechs each with their own weapons and abilities, and a backpack can be fitted with additional weapons found in the game's 9 levels, including rocket launchers and gravity inverters. And if that's not enough variety for you, you can even ditch the mech entirely and run around on foot. Granted, you'll get turned into wallpaper paste instantly if one of the mech weapons flies in your general direction, but humans can get to places mechs can't, providing excellent scouting opportunities. It's like 2D Titanfall, and the slimmest chance I get to mention Titanfall, I'm going to mention Titanfall. As run and gun shooters go, Metal Warriors ranks among the most ambitious on the SNES, and yet it manages to live up to those lofty goals even today. It's pretty super. You wonderful lot are eager to give us lots of weird and forgotten video game suggestions all the time, offering 2 or more at once quite often, like the commenter with the name The Real Nameless One. Something doesn't add up there, my boy. 2 games I would recommend to take a look at are Super Varlis 4 and Ys 3, Wanderers of Ys. Both have fast-paced action, good music, and nice visuals with a heavy dose of difficulty. While we'd love to talk about both, considering Ys is still going pretty strong, did it get a new game just last year? It did, yes. Let's waffle on about Super Varlis 4 instead, an intriguing entry and equally intriguing series. Varlis itself is a series of anime-inspired action platformers released for the PC-88 and TurboGrafx-16/PC Engine in the 80s and early 90s. While you might not have heard of them, Varlis was decently beloved at the time, so much so that attempts were made to bring Varlis to the SNES and Sega Genesis, with Super Varlis 4 and Sid of Varlis respectively. What's more interesting though is the SNES version of Varlis 4 is pretty different from the original game. A few of the game's levels have been removed completely, while a brand new level, Castle Vanity, was created just for the SNES. Some of the playable characters were also removed, though the overall story remains basically the same. There's space goddesses, dark princes, and all sorts of stuff that would make Games Workshop bolt upright. If you feel like experiencing Varlis for yourself though, there's been several compilations released on Nintendo Switch and PC that include all the regular Varlis games, along with Super Varlis 4. If you're in the mood for some obscure platforming action, give them a shot. Matey.
ask most small kids what they love to be when they grow up, and a lot of them would probably say pirate. All of us 30-plus-year-olds managed that pretty early on when downloading Linkin Park Numb Not a Virus.exe from LimeWire. Every 1 hour I waited for one song to download was more than I could take. Presumably not lost in the undertow, Jazzy921 offered a SNES game that provides a safe alternative for your PC, and also a game that we previously shouted out in our SNES games ahead of their time video. Uncharted Waters and its sequel New Horizons play differently than most of the games that came out on the SNES. While both games do a great job at depicting life on the high seas, the amount of improvements offered in the sequel make it worth recommending. At their core, both Uncharted Waters games set players off as a legend to be during the Age of Discovery, sailing the oceans in search of new land, new treasure, or just someone else's ship to rob. New Horizons offered 6 different protagonists, each with their own job role that defined what they'd taken to the seas for. Whether it's a pirate, a merchant, a privateer, or an explorer, your style of sailing is well represented here. Through your actions and the actions of the characters around you, different political power plays and changes can occur, making for a lively RPG. There's a lot to sink your teeth into with Uncharted Waters New Horizons, almost overwhelmingly so in fact, but the sheer existence of those staggeringly large RPGs on the SNES just goes to show how versatile and wonderful Nintendo's console truly was. Plus, Uncharted Waters New Horizons is still 10 million times better than Skull and Bones. Womp womp.